Last time on the WizardCast.
Hey, Mark.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for coming in. We just gotta, go through this new year paperwork, and I figured, while we're at it, we could actually make an episode.
Yes, sounds good. I mean, it's been a while.
All right, cool. Hey, let's start with these forms here.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna fill this one out. Oh.
Did you see on the news about that old space station that's supposed to be breaking orbit and crashing to Earth today?
No, is it Russian?
Well, I don't think it's in a hurry to fall. No.
I meant.
Yeah. Anyways, apparently they think some of the pieces aren't even going to break up in the atmosphere, and it could be dangerous. But of course, you're not going to say where they're going to land because they don't want to cause a panic and risk the economy. Go figure.
Hey, Brian, do you hear something?
Hear what?
Sounds like something falling.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but that appears to be a chunk of debris falling from the sky.
Yeah, they're leaving fiery trails behind them, too.
Like they would be if they're,
breaking atmosphere?
Yeah, you can actually see where some of them are. They're totally not breaking apart.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that one's a toilet.
Hey, Mark?
Yeah, Brian?
Does that toilet kind of look like it's
coming straight for us?
Well, I was going to say, does it look like it's going to miss us, but...
Yeah, no.
Rat baskets.
And now the conclusion of the WizardCast.
I'm Brian Kwong.
And I'm Mark Ross.
We're Salesforce experts that love talking about technology and Salesforce.
We also love humor. Doesn't mean we're actually good at it.
In the Salesforce community, I'm known as the Salesforce Wizard, likely due to me wearing a wizard hat at Salesforce events.
And I'm known as Salesforce Yoda for pretty much the same reason.
You should see the ears.
We have a passion to help educate and entertain people.
So we've joined forces to create WizardCast.
We've got tips and best practices.
We talk with interesting people.
All mixed with quote-unquote jokes and humor.
Welcome to the WizardCast.
Warning. Host identification failure. Catastrophic damage detected. Integrity failure imminent. Initializing emergency episode protocols. Playing introduction.
What did the pony say to the rancher?
What did the pony say to the rancher, Brian?
Can I have a glass of water? I'm a little hoarse.
Joke failure detected. Humor failure imminent. Initializing emergency content. Playing recorded interview.
So today we're going to actually talk about documentation. No. Don't run away. Trust me, this is going to be a great topic because joining us, we have John Varese. He is the Senior Director of Documentation for Salesforce.org. And he is my former boss, an all-around amazing guy. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you, Mark. I am very sad that I am your former boss.
Well, indeed. It took Flo to pull me away from you, John. And I say that with
This is why I
no
hate Flo
smoke.
to this day, and I don't care who hears that.
but honestly, I say that with no smoke. Like,
If you're listening, Jerry Rebstock, you owe me.
Jerry's my current boss, the one who pulled me away. But yes, John is an amazing boss, an amazing person, and we're going to talk about Doc.
Yes, and now, dear listener, you know that there is no ulterior motive here because it's a former boss, not current boss. There's no brown nosing or suck up involved here, more than normally is with our guests.
That's usually from you, Brian, but yeah. Regardless, so John, let's talk about docs. Why is documentation important?
Wow. Well, for Salesforce, it's particularly important because as nice as the website is and as cute as all the Trailhead characters are, and as beautiful as our marketing color schemes are, Salesforce is a notoriously difficult product to use, let alone master. So the documentation, which is what our department does for all of the .org products, 3 clouds, philanthropy cloud, nonprofit cloud, education cloud. The documentation is really the first line of success for the user. It is developed alongside the product. We work with the engineers every day. As the engineers are building the features, we're building the documentation. And it's the first thing that the customer gets or is supposed to get to aid them in their journey of learning these very complex, complicated products.
And for Salesforce, like that's, like you said, that's all the more important because it is such a complicated product with so many different aspects. And you yourself, you're only, and I say only, it's still a huge amount. You got those 3 aspects. So how is it, I mean, what is your goal, right? What is the goal at the end of the day? It's to help users, but can you give us a little more detail about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really 2 goals. One is to basically just show users how to use the product. I mean, how does this work? I need to enable this setting. I need to customize this field, whatever. That's documentation at the most basic, right? Your basic instructions. And that's what we're on the hook to deliver. At .org, we'd like to think of ourselves as taking it a little bit further with what we call compassionate documentation, which comes out of our values and really all of Salesforce's values of compassion and trust and empathy. And we try to look at the documentation really as more than just a learning tool, but a communication device and an empowerment device and a world changer device, if you will. The documentation, insofar as it is the thing that is teaching you how to use the product, it is also that thing that is then enabling you to use Salesforce and to be the most successful that you can be at Salesforce, and therefore have the greatest impact out in the world that you can have. And for our customers at .org in particular, which are schools and nonprofits of all shapes and sizes, everything from small PTAs to the Sierra Club to the United Nations, they all have to use Salesforce to do their work. And the more we can enable them to be successful, the more impact we can all have out there on the world. So we really look at the documentation as this enablement tool, not just for Salesforce, but for creating positive impact and positive change in the world. And I realize, I'm listening to myself say this, and I realize that is a very tall order for documentation, for technical documentation. And it is a tall order for technical documentation, but I really do believe that technical documentation can live up to that. And so I'm always trying to, you got to get the technical writers on board if you want to be successful with this strategy. And at .org, thank goodness, mostly we do have the technical writers on board, and it's great until they leave us for other teams.
Wow, I'm just going to hear about that for the next 30 to 40 minutes, aren't I?
You think it's not going to progress after the 30 to 40 minutes?
I mean, that is you say tall order. I mean, that's almost putting it lightly. If you're talking about like the United Nations is dependent upon what you write. Like, isn't that some pressure?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Well, I mean, let me turn it back on you, Mark, actually. You were on the team for a while. You were into this philosophy. You didn't have a ton of tech writing experience when you came to the team, but you had a ton of Salesforce experience. You were certainly no stranger to the ecosystem. What did you think when you came in and, we were trying this out, we were trying this methodology out? How did you feel as a writer trying this thing out?
I mean, yeah, because you were my first writing gig, my first formal writing gig, right? And it was like this idea that all these nonprofits and all these schools, because it was actually schools to start with when I first started with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was the idea that schools, and I had an original background in education. My first tech job was setting up LAMP servers, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, for LMS hosting, specifically for schools and nonprofits. And yeah, it was like, oh, I get to do this again. I get to help schools again. And that was pretty cool. And then it kind of expanded out into nonprofits. It's like, oh, well, we're doing bigger work now. And I hate to say this, John, but now I feel like I'm doing even bigger work to a certain degree, because, like, for example, one of the pro bono projects I actually did a pro bono project, and I probably shouldn't say who it was just for confidentiality purposes, but it was for a nonprofit that's near and dear to my heart. And I'm sure for a lot of people here who are listening as well. It's one that we've probably all heard of. And I got to help them with Flow. And this happened right before I shifted over to Flow documentation. I was like, wow, so it really brought it home that the things I'm writing are directly affecting probably this nonprofit. They're affecting all these other for-profits. The tide of the world shifts ever so slightly.
Yeah.
On the balance of a word.
Yeah. Beautifully put. Like a real writer. Yeah.
So Brian, how are you doing over there?
What part of documentation isn't boring, or when are we going to get to that bit?
Okay.
Well,
so
no, I mean,
we're done popping ourselves up.
It's like, it's great. Okay, that's the tenets for over at Salesforce and .org. The importance of documentation. Other than the person that consumes the documentation, why should I care?
Yeah,
You mean as a developer?
Well, or an admin, or a person who's doing BA work, or a person that's doing anything particular as a Salesforce customer or ISV or partner.
But I want to backtrack for a second, Brian, because you said what part isn't boring, right? And that is a totally legitimate question, and something I'm hesitating here because I'm trying to pull up our compassionate technical writing guide, because I want to read you the way we start the compassionate technical writing guide. The introduction, which is called "Technical and Human Are Not Mutually Exclusive." And then it begins. Let's face it, technical writing isn't the type of writing that typically draws you in. It's usually dry and boring. A utilitarian kind of writing that takes you from one task to another and not much beyond that. But it doesn't have to be. At Salesforce.org, the documentation team is committed to producing user documentation experiences that not only show our users how to use Salesforce, but also reflect empathy and awareness of the challenges they face. Through countless interactions with members of our community, we've learned that it's not enough to write docs that simply describe how to use our products. We want community members to feel the greater importance of what they're doing. We want to tell stories, we want to tell their stories, and we want to let users know that we care about them. So you're not off, Brian, with your question, which is, that's how we typically think. We typically think about technical writing as the thing you have to slog through to use the product. But I mean, it's almost like a larger existential question about living in the world of technology, right? Which is like, why do we do anything that we do in the tech world? And yeah, we all have to have jobs and make money to some extent to just sort of live, right? But there's that larger communal aspect to what we're all doing, because none of us are working in total isolation on anything. Every project you do is involving human interaction. And so that's how we came to these ideas around compassion in technical writing, because we realized, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but like we realized that there are like people who are reading this stuff, and those people have jobs, they have dynamics in whatever offices they're in, they have children, they have parents, they have problems, they have joys, they have all the things that people and human beings have. And so why would we want to give those readers something that's merely mechanical? when we could, with some effort, give those readers something that really speaks to them, or that really tries to speak to them, so that their lives, that there's one component of what they have to do, which is read this effing manual, right? So that at least we can try to make that component of this thing that they have to do to drive their life, whatever that means, we can make that a little bit more relatable for them.
So do you have like a classic example you use to say, hey, here's an example of non-compassionate documentation versus what you would consider compassionate documentation?
We do. We have a couple of those that we've used in presentations. Let me pull up the
And I love what John is doing here, because he is embodying the first rule of technical writing. And that is, don't write any more new words than you have to. He is literally going to look up stuff that's already been written so that he doesn't have to write it on the fly talking to us right now.
I thought the first rule was you don't talk about compassionate documentation writing.
We do. So Brian, in this guide that I keep referring to, which is sort of like our little
It's a style guide, kind of.
It's sort of like a style guide, but it's more like a philosophy guide for new writers who come into the department mainly, but we've shared it with lots of people. We have the after versions of it. We don't have the before versions of it, so it's not written out as an exercise. But I will give you a very specific example, because one of the examples we have in the style guide is around volunteers for Salesforce. It was one of the first ones that we did, and your typical sort of overviewy intro material technical writing stuff for products generally would say something like, volunteers for Salesforce is offers many features that do the following, and lets your organization do this, and this, and increases your efficiency this way, and if you're looking to, manage hundreds of volunteers, it can do that for you, and you can customize the fields too while you're at it, right? Like, it basically kind of just lays it out like that. The writer at the time, who was working on it at the time, Sarah Marovich, took a stab with the rest of the team on perhaps taking a different approach to that kind of like ABC of what the feature can do. And so she and the team came up with this. So just imagine opening up, on your browser or print it or whatever, opening up the Volunteers for Salesforce help. And instead of saying, Volunteers for Salesforce comes with every install of NPSP and is Salesforce's application that lets you manage a fleet of volunteers. So instead of seeing kind of that basic thing, what you see in the current one is a quote at the top of the page that says, I never want the day to end. And then it continues. That's Sarah, a volunteer at a local community kitchen in Seattle, Washington. Sarah has two great passions in life, cooking and other people. The food she prepares goes out to cancer patients and their families who no longer have the time or the ability to cook. Sarah's connections at the kitchen remind her of what's really important to her. Volunteering connects her directly with her community, takes her outside of herself, and helps her appreciate the responsibility we all have towards each other. When volunteering and connection inspire such big feelings, who would ever want the day to end? And here's the transition into the technical documentation. Sarah is one of hundreds of volunteers that the community kitchen tracks with Volunteers for Salesforce, an application for volunteer management that has transformed nonprofit organizations and their efforts worldwide. Volunteers are the lifeblood of so many nonprofit organizations like yours, and V4S provides a way to effectively manage volunteer relationships. In a world of so much distraction and competing priorities, tools like V4S are crucial for helping organizations connect with and inspire their Sarahs. V4S helps you manage the volunteer jobs an organization needs filled, track the hours and shifts a volunteer works. So see how now we're going back into that more traditional tech writer bullet list kind of thing, but it's embellished with this very human stuff. And it's a bullet list of about, it looks like 6 bullets here of kind of the key features that Volunteers for Salesforce gives you. Send a reminder and thank you emails. And then it concludes with Salesforce.org offers Volunteers for Salesforce along with the Nonprofit Success Pack. Both are free for any, tech writer stuff more. This guide shows you how to use V4S and demonstrates how you too can help create days you and your volunteers never want to end. So it becomes a whole narrative, right? It becomes a whole narrative of a way to think about the product, a way to think about using the product, and a way to think about how your engagement with the product as a user and your engagement with the documentation as a user is part of this like larger human thing called life that we all kind of have to go through whether we like it or not.
See, as a writer, I like the fact that it elicits some very specific emotions and imagery in there. As a person who has consumed a lot of tech writing,
yeah,
my first jerk was, I'm going to gloss over all the text until I get to the bullet list because I just need to know how the darn thing works.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Brian. We have had that response, so this is not like bulletproof, but what we've been going on is the very special and unique audiences for .org, which are your educators and your nonprofit workers. Lot of accidental admins in the .org customer world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they don't have any more time than anybody else, but they are a constituency that kind of is more open to this kind of language and is set more at ease by this kind of language. I mean, absolutely right, Brian. And this is actually one of the kind of the challenges with doing this kind of work is you have to really strike this balance and really not alienate people such as yourself, because right, you could come into this and be like, Salesforce.org documentation is full of all these personal stories. I don't want to do this. I need to know how to customize this field. And that's totally legitimate. And we've had people actually tell us exactly what you just said, which is like, this is all great, but when I'm going to documentation, I just need the steps to produce, and that's what I'm interested in. And that's fine. And then this kind of writing isn't for you. But for the people who do need and want more of the why, and for whom that why, and in fact, Brian, I don't know you very well, but I go so far as to say that you're not resistant to the why. You just don't have time to engage with it at that moment. And when you're going into tech docs, you just kind of need that answer. But even the fact that you know that why is there, even if I'm forcing you to gloss over it, we're saying something as Salesforce and as Salesforce.org by producing this kind of documentation. It's a statement about us and what we care about and what we're putting our resources into. And I hope that would carry itself out to you, so that that if you ever did have a couple extra minutes to think about the why, you might just sit down. I've also had people tell me that they've pulled this stuff up when they're in the airport and start reading it, and it really moves them, right? So we've had like, please don't give me this, I just need my steps, to wow, I never expected this would be in the documentation. This is awesome. I found myself in an airport and I started scrolling and I just started reading this thing and it was like almost pleasurable, right? So I kind of, at this point, we're at this place of, we do want it to be there for the people who it might speak to. But I also don't want to alienate people like you totally. So I'm not going to give you 4 pages of this, right? I'm going to give you half to 3/4 of a page of it so that you can easily skip over it if you want to, and it won't be there. But if you want a little bit more feel goods, Brian, it's there for you.
It's not on every topic and every page. It's just in
That's
the
right.
Well, it's also partly because that's the way I was trained to read technical documentation. Is you don't go. I mean, for that matter, that was the way I was trained to write technical documentation. Is you have at max 2 sentences of what we would call fluff, and then the rest of it is make it easy to consume, make it easy to read, make it easy to grab the general points. So lots of bullets and short paragraphs and things like that. So part of it is probably just because that's the way I was taught. This is how you find the information that you want.
Yeah, it's not just. I mean, I'm giving you this example here, which is this kind of like very grand overview about volunteers for Salesforce. There are many sort of components to what compassionate technical writing is. So another aspect of it, for example, is which one, you might not even notice it, which is, say we set this story up with Sarah in the beginning of the V4S guide, right? And so now we have actually a character called Sarah who works in this food delivery kitchen place, right? And so that now humanizes what the application is doing. It's now not, the bullet list, which starts out, manage the volunteer jobs an organization needs filled, track the hours and shifts of volunteer works. It's now not just tracking the hours and shifts of volunteer work. It's tracking Sarah's hours and shifts. And so when you go to do whatever your procedure is, you need later in the guide, deep in the guide, that name might appear in the example. You'll see people in the screen, in the data for the examples that we use, so that the whole thing feels real. We try not to use like, Sally student and
But that alliteration,
mom 1 and mom 2 type thing. We try to
Potter.
Well, that we can't use. Mark,
Well,
you should
I
know
mean-
that.
No, I know. That's what I'm saying. We can't use it.
I like it because it's almost like taking development user stories
Yeah.
and narrating it in the actual documentation, which when you read it makes more sense than doing the generic student A, student B, volunteer 1, volunteer 2 type of thing.
Well, there is this thing, maybe you've heard it, which we say in the doc world, which is every page is page 1, just because of Google and the way people search. And you just simply cannot assume ever that people are coming into your doc set and going to be involved with it in the structure that you have built it, right? Like they're coming in, they're Googling, they're landing on an article, they have no context for that article, right? But if the writer who owns this project has built that help system, has architected that whole help system around this human story, that humanity, right? That humanity flows, Mark, through, right? It flows through the whole thing.
Another little needle.
That was delayed reaction on my part.
I'll do these all for Jerry, Mark's boss. So that stuff flows through the docs. And so even if it's page 1 and you're like, 7,500 lines in to the doc set, you're still going to get a little bit of that feeling in the way the sentences constructed and the sample data we're using. So that's another big idea behind compassionate writing, is that it is really trying to humanize the whole enterprise of documentation, so that every user that is working with it is whether consciously or subconsciously or osmotically, right? Like just sort of absorbing that idea that we're not just, creating custom objects and custom fields here. We're actually doing something when we do those things. And the things that we're doing have an impact.
Yeah.
So
Doing them for people.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad that Salesforce and .org are using the compassionate documentation in their own stuff. You know, as much as I give you crap about it, I do actually read the stuff on a regular basis to appreciate. It's maybe not the fluff the narrative at the top, but more when you get down to the specifics with the user. Would you advocate to the admin or a developer or someone at a customer org who's having to write documentation, because you're all documenting your org, right?
Right.
To use the same compassionate documentation tenets in their own documentation?
Gosh, I mean, I think it should be used in all documentation. I think across the whole industry. Look, it grew out of .org because of our constituency, and because the technical writers at .org have this really unique relationship with the user base. We talk to the people who read our stuff more than any other group of technical writers anywhere. I think I realize that sounds like hyperbole, but I know a lot of technical writers. I've been at a lot of places. I've never worked at a place where the technical writers are in almost daily communication with the people who are reading our documentation. And that's, 80% of that is due to the Power of Us Hub, which is Salesforce.org's unique user community. It's Salesforce.org's version of the Trailblazer community, right? And the hub and the community that it creates and the generosity of the community, right? So you've got, nonprofit and education people are, they're not in their business to make money. They're not in that. Nobody goes and works for a nonprofit to become really wealthy, right? So they're there because
that's what I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, Brian, come on, man. I mean, they're there because they believe in something. And that kind of personality is the personality that makes up the Power of Us Hub. And so, we've got, look, 25% of our documentation at Salesforce.org is actually written by external users that donate it to us from the nonprofits, And when I say donate, I mean we work with them very closely, but we want the input from the community because the community will always be greater experts at all of this stuff than we could ever be, right? And so to get there, my point is that they're very generous with these contributions. And because of that, we started, and I'm going back now to the history of how this came to be. Like, we just started seeing wow, we just had such a connection with the people who were reading our stuff. We thought we should be writing this in a different way. We were almost, at one point it was almost like, it's kind of embarrassing to just write traditional tech docs for these people so well, because it just feels so impersonal. At the simplest level, it's kind of like we just wanted to write more personal, cooler stuff for people because we knew them.
Well, that makes sense. That makes sense for, people who are an admin at a company, because they're writing documentation for, let's assume small or medium, at most a couple hundred people, right? Maybe a bit more than that. And so they're going to know a lot of those people. They're going to be interacting with those people. That was me, right? When I was the admin, when I was setting up stuff and having to write documentation for the new apps I was creating on the platform, I knew every single person that was going to use it. And it was weird.
It was weird writing that stuff?
It was weird writing stuff that was impersonal and cold.
It's like addressing a letter to your mother, dear sir or madam.
Right.
Kinda, yeah. That's definitely kind of the feeling. But again, the challenge, you really hit it, Brian, when you said boring before, because the challenge is, technical writing is normally boring for a reason. It's for these reasons we're talking about, because you've got to get shit done, and you've got to have the steps there, and you just got to get people through it. But it's like, who doesn't want to know more about the why ultimately. I think that's just part of everybody's, unless you're just some total automaton just going to work every day and like plugging in numbers, which people may be, but they would be less of that if they, had a little sentence with a human being in it once in a while.
Now, we've been talking mostly about like customer facing or user facing. There's other types of documentation, right? Like internal dev doc.
Yeah.
How does compassionate writing apply towards that?
Well, as you may remember, we don't really have any. We've tried to. I can't speak too much to internal dev doc because we really don't have a formal system for it at .org yet. It's something we've never quite been able to get off the ground. But funny you should bring it up, Mark, because one of your former colleagues, Julie, just recently worked with the developers to redesign the tech spec template for the EDA team, the Education Data Architecture team, to be a quote unquote more compassionate spec template.
Interesting.
And they did all which is, this is the closest thing we have to DevDoc.
Right.
The tech specs that delineate what the new features are going to be.
The objects and the fields. And
new objects, new fields, all that stuff. Yeah. And, apparently it was not very compassionate because it had so much stuff in it. And so they've that's another approach to compassion, right? It doesn't need to be sort of use case based with the character. It could also be, we're going to create this more compassionate template because it helps us work better together. It helps us think about these things better together, more efficiently. We can, again, all goes back to impact. Ultimately, everything, especially at .org, but in general, I think everything goes back to what is the level of impact these decisions that you're making are going to have. And so Julie and the team are increasing their impact tremendously by coming up with this new template that makes the team work better, that makes the team communicate better because now it's this thing that's much easier to read. And maybe most importantly, it makes everyone else just involved happier. They're just happier at doing what they need to do because life just became a lot easier.
And that's part of the main education cloud documentation now?
No, this is internal stuff.
Oh, it's internal stuff.
These are the templates that the developers and the writers and the UX and the QE that they use to outline the features they're going to build.
How do you do that compassionately?
Well, like I just said, you mean how do you do the template compassionally?
Well, how does one do a tech spec, like a list of objects and fields?
Start with, I'm sorry you have to read this.
Well, again, a lot of this it's hard. I wish I could kind of show you sort of talk about before and afters, because there was a before that they were using, which was just this data dump and laundry list of stuff that was like,
yeah, I remember.
You just open it up and your eyes.
It's a spreadsheet. It was a spreadsheet.
Yeah. More like just go on for pages and pages. Whereas, I don't know. They categorized it differently. They are putting more effort into thinking about what the actual use cases are, so that things do make sense, right? You have the use case up front, kind of just like what we're doing for the documentation. You have the use case up front. It's clearly identified, clearly described. You can then go through so that the things make sense as you're talking about building them. You can actually draw on examples and use them. And it's all just generally much shorter. I think they cut it down from something like 4 pages to 2.
So if I was someone who writes documentation and wanted to give my hand at writing more compassionately, what would be the list of guidelines? Or better yet, if we were not a podcast and instead we were a terrible BuzzFeed article, what would the BuzzFeed Article B for here's your top 10 things to know whether or not you're writing compassionately.
I can give you the URL to the style guide. We've got and we're always in the process of revising this, by the way.
And that's something that's freely shareable.
Yeah, the technical writing guide is publicly available. We have some other material that's compassionate oriented for developers and things that we had to keep internal, but the actual technical writer compassion guide is a public URL.
We can put that in the show notes so anybody can get to it.
Yeah.
Yep. So tenet number 1, go to the show notes, click on the link for the style guide. Tenet 2, read style guide.
But the horrible BuzzFeed article is probably the 4th section of the guide. So the guide is divided into 5 sections. It's the intro that I quoted from earlier. Technical and human are not mutually exclusive. Then there's a what is it section. Then there's a why it matters section. And then the horrible BuzzFeed article would be the how to do it section, which basically gives sort of like 4 tenets, which are be yourself, tell a story, take care of your reader, and don't force it. And each one of those is expanded upon in the guide. The don't force it one being extremely important.
Oh, yeah.
As Mark said earlier, and in fact, when Mark was with us, he was working on like a super, super technical product. We still wove compassionate stories in there, but sometimes it's just like, okay, I have this data import thing that I just need to give the instructions to, and we are just not going to try to force compassion into this because this really is just some one pager that someone needs to follow and just get them through it type of thing. So, we're always making choices about this stuff. And of course, you don't put it in every single thing that you write because, if you've seen any of our help systems, some of them are enormous. I mean, NPSP, I think, if you print out NPSP, it's something like 1,200 pages.
Ugh.
Oh, yeah, NPSP is huge.
Yeah, don't print out NPSP.
Yeah. So
I killed a printer doing that once.
You tried to print out NPSP?
Yeah, back I was doing. I wasn't a consultant. It was so long ago. I think it was probably called not Success Pack. It was probably called
Starter Pack.
Starter Pack. And I did one of the big hunking photocopy copy printers at the office. It got so hot printing the document it stopped working.
It's not compassionate.
The printer died just trying to put the toner to the paper. Yeah.
Non-profit move there, or anti-profit.
The don't force it section, which is the fourth tenet. It's really brief. It just reads, if it doesn't feel like it will work, don't do it. This is really important. It's much better to produce standard technical documentation, Brian, that has little or no love.
It actually says Brian in there. Wow, talk about directing to your audience.
Brian, that has little or no love, than to produce something that feels forced, gratuitous, or inorganic. Not every piece of technical writing will lend itself to compassion. So be judicious and don't force it.
See, personally, I would find the be yourself very dangerous because that would mean that my technical documentation would be full of really bad puns.
And spelling mistakes.
That's why we have peer editors. For every 20 of your puns, we'd probably accept 2.
See, that would make the challenge of how subtle of a pun can I create so no one notices it.
No, we did. Mark can tell you, we've had writing workshops where we've had writers come in and kind of overdo it a little bit, and it'd be a little bit overdone, and we get a bunch of writers in the writing room, and we're all looking and we're like, no, it's just, 4 sentences of this language is too much. We need to cut it down to 1.5. right, Mark? I mean,
Oh
you're
yeah.
in the workshops. Like, it has to be balanced, and I mean, everybody, whether you're writing compassionate, technical writing, or anything, everybody needs editing, and so all of our stuff goes through a lot of editing from multiple eyes. So I feel like that's probably a key to the success too, because I think we have a really good sort of internal check system in place that guards us from ever going off the rails compassionately, right?
All right. Well, I think we're coming up on time. We have a little tradition, John. If there was one thing that you wanted to share before we sign off, what's that? What do you want to share with your audience, that your platform of our mothers that you're now able to speak to?
What would I share? Well, I'd be totally self-serving, Mark, and plug my novel.
Do it.
You wrote a novel?
He's a novelist. He's got an agent and everything.
No, I want to know. As someone who's been struggling with, because I went to school for creative writing and professional writing.
Yeah.
Look where I am now. I was doing short stories, like collections of short stories, which does not sell. That's why I'm not in that business.
Novels most don't either.
Most don't either. But I'm actually really impressed with anyone who can write a novel, because the amount of effort and organization to write a novel, let alone to get yourself to write the novel, is extraordinary. So I don't mind you plugging your novel.
It's not easy.
Well, what's your novel? Is it fiction, nonfiction?
It's a novel, Brian, so it's fiction.
You can have nonfiction novels.
They're
typically called biographies, but
Actually, you're right. Truman Capote wrote In Cold Blood, and he called it a nonfiction novel because he wrote it. In Cold Blood was really the first book that inaugurated that genre of this kind of nonfiction book that reads like a novel. But most novels are fiction, Brian. So, so I wrote. It's published 2 years ago now, 2018. Called The Spirit Photographer. It's about a man who claims he can photograph ghosts in the late 19th century after the Civil War, and he basically gets into some trouble, and it's based on like a real. There were these real charlatans in the 19th century going and creating spirit photographs. So I worked on that for about 6 years, and then I managed to get it published. And I did when I went on book tour, I basically booked a reading event everywhere where Salesforce was sending me to work.
Nice.
So that's why there were a lot of readings in like Portland, Seattle, San Francisco.
Nothing wrong with that.
Los Angeles. So gotta kind of take advantage of where you're at.
And hey, it's on Audible and everything.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes.
I have credits free. I'm getting this.
Yeah, that'd be great. It has nothing to do with. I wish I could say there were some. I wish I could say there were like some relationship to my technical work, but there's pretty much none. Other than, well, you might find this interesting, Mark. I plan stuff out the same way we do like agile work at Salesforce, with like a lot of sticky tabs, sticky notes, a lot of markers,
Kanban board,
a lot of whiteboards, a lot of moving around of pieces and stuff, and that's how I generate plot. And I mean, I would be doing some form of that anyway, but the very particular post-it note marker whiteboard thing is definitely a trait I picked up from Salesforce.
End of content. Initialize outro.
WizardCast is produced by Brian Kwong and Mark Russ, directed by Brian Kwong and Mark Russ, technical administration by Brian Kwong and Mark Russ, script writing by Brian Kwong and Mark Russ, audio editing by Brian Kwong and Mark Russ, website maintenance by Brian Kwong and Mark Russ, and I return this episode with Matthew Resnick.
Follow us at WizardCast_pod on Twitter, and perhaps
we'll select you as an esteemed member of our intern pool.
Just remember to sign the WizardCast handbook.
Have a joke, interview suggestion, or other comments? Let us know. You can call and leave a voice recording at 608-492-0321 or email wizardcast@thewizardnews.com.
And it's been 6 months, so we're almost due for an idea exchange highlight episode.
Almost.
Do you have an idea you would like to hear us talk about and share with others?
Go to bit.ly/idea highlight all lowercase to submit that idea to us.
Don't forget to subscribe to the WizardCast and receive our next episode automatically.
And please post reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcast app of choice and share this episode. It helps others to hear what you just had to endure.
Once again, I'm Brian.
And I'm...
Humor failure imminent.
Thanks for listening.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah, Mark.
Are we dead?
Well, crushed by a falling space toilet. Now standing in an empty, black, echoing void. Yeah, I think we might be.
Bogus.